Hello everyone, my name is Neil Harris and welcome to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. Today I'm going to be talking to you about mediation in the language classroom. So I'm sure you're familiar with this scenario. A lot of people standing around gossiping, something I'm sure you're all familiar with, as I say. And I guess there are a number of explanations of what we can see here. It may well be that the man in the black jacket is talking to the lady in the black jacket and saying that he's heard some confidential company information from the lady in white. And she's now worried that she's done something wrong. Or it could be that the man's heard that the lady in white has broken company rules and that this is going to go around the office like wildfire, obviously causing the lady in white a sense of discomfort and embarrassment. Or finally, it might be something personal. The lady in white suffers from migraines and she's being bullied by her peer group, the gentleman in white and the lady in the blue suit. What do they have in common? Well, as you can see on the screen, they are all examples of mediation. In this case, mediation in the real world. And the number of people that we can see on the screen here is key. This isn't a case of interaction, two people talking together, but it's a case of three people involved. The gentleman in the black suit, the lady in the black suit, and the lady in the white blouse. And this is the key difference between interaction and mediation. In mediation, we always have three elements as part of what's going on. And this is going to be the backbone of what we will be talking about in today's masterclass. So in terms of what I'd like to cover with you today, there are three main areas. Number one, a short introduction, a definition of, well, what is mediation in language teaching and in English language teaching. We'll then move on to talk about mediation in the classroom and how it affects us in terms of things like coursebooks, supplementary materials, and examinations. And then, perhaps most importantly for you, we'll look at some ideas for mediation activities. So, what is mediation? I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea of mediation as something to be close to the idea of arbitration. There's maybe a conflict, something that people are uncomfortable with, and a third person comes along to try to make the peace. Now, whilst mediation in language teaching is linked in a way to this wider definition of mediation, in fact, in language teaching, it has a slightly different definition, and that's what we will go on to look at next. So in language teaching, and this is a definition that's come from Tom Kiddle, and I think is a very user-friendly one. Mediation is when we use language to explain something to someone who doesn't fully understand it without our help. And immediately we can see the three elements there. We are explaining something to someone. So there's you, there's the someone, and there is the theme being explained. And we are acting as an intermediary, a mediator, a bridge to help them to understand it, because without our intervention, our help, that may not be possible. Now, you may well be thinking, well, yeah, but I've never really heard of mediation. And if that's the case, please don't worry, because I think it is, or at least has been, largely invisible in English language teaching. So I went to my four go-to texts to see if I could find any help, and here they are. So I had a look in Scott Thornberry's A to Z blog of ELT, which came to an end online in 2017. It was absent. I looked in the 4th edition of the Longman Dictionary of Language Teaching and Applied Linguistics. Again, no mention. I looked in the printed new A to Z of ELT, again by Scott Thornberry, not there. And then I looked in Key Issues in Language Teaching by Jack Richards, and again, not mentioned. So it's perhaps not surprising that there's something a bit like a invisibility cloak that's going on in ELT with mediation. Much as Harry Potter could hide things with his cloak, it would seem for many language teachers that mediation is somehow invisible, which is a real shame, because in fact it is an important area, as I hope that this masterclass will demonstrate. So where did it come from? In the same way as the Big Bang is one way of thinking about where we came from, then we need to look at where did mediation come from. And I think most people will agree, although it had been mentioned previously, it was the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, that first edition, that brought mediation into the realm of language teaching. Obviously not just English, but other European languages. But perhaps more importantly, it was the second version, the companion, which refined and expanded our understanding of mediation, which, as we are going to see, is like gossiping, something that we all do naturally anyway, and has made it much more a focus and an emergent focus for English language teaching. So if we think about ELT now, and we go back to the CEFR, this is what the CEFR has to say about mediation. A complex process where the learner acts as a social agent who creates bridges and helps to construct or convey meaning, sometimes within the same language, sometimes from one language to another. And this is a key point, not present explicitly in Tom Kiddle's definition, but what we can see here is that mediation really does capture that zeitgeist, that increasingly people are moving away from a position of communicative language teaching where it's L2 only, just English, to being much more comfortable with the idea of using 2 or more languages in the language classroom. The ascent of translation, the increased interest in translanguaging, seems to fit in very nicely with this plurilingual approach to mediation, where, as I think we would all accept naturally, you may well have someone who doesn't speak a language. So let's take, for example, someone who is German, wanting to speak to someone who is French, and they need a third person, an English speaker, to mediate for them. So mediation in language teaching does allow for the use of L1 and English as an L2, or if you prefer, there is no reason why you can't mediate just via L2, English itself. If we come back to Tom Kiddle and Tom's definition again, mediation is when we use language to explain something to someone who doesn't fully understand it without our help. As Tom himself says in his article, it's useful to unpack exactly what we're talking about, and that's what we're going to do right now. So in terms of that unpacking, mediation is when we use language to explain something. Okay, what exactly do we mean by something? Who is the someone? And in terms of who doesn't fully understand it, what are the potential barriers to that full understanding? Let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. Okay, let's start with looking at the explain something. And if we look at the CEFR, we'll realize that the something might be another person or a group of people. It might be an idea, a concept, or it might be a text itself. And these are all aspects of mediation. We can mediate people, we can mediate ideas, and I think this is something that CLIL teachers have been doing for years without necessarily using the word mediation, or it can also be something we've read, clearly therefore of massive value for EAP. It's therefore about taking an existing piece of communication, which comes not from the mediator, but is the extra source, the third element. Okay, so moving on, what about the someone? So in mediation, it may well be that you are mediating for someone who doesn't share the same language as the something. So I might be looking at an Arabic text in a restaurant, not understand it, and then a speaker of Arabic mediates the text for me from Arabic into English. It may be mediation across levels. And it might be a person who not only has a lower language level, but potentially someone who has a lower conceptual understanding than the mediator. If we move on to that third element, we've looked at the something and the someone. We now consider the barriers to understanding. They're coming up on screen now. So barriers can include, for example, cross-linguistic, as I've mentioned already. Looking at a menu, you're a group of students from a language school somewhere in the UK or an English-speaking country go out for a meal. They go to an Italian restaurant, and amongst them is an Arabic speaker of English, but who doesn't understand Italian. So someone with a better understanding of Italian mediates across languages, from Italian to English for an Arabic speaker of English. But it doesn't just have to be linguistic, it can be at level barriers. So it may well be, for example, that in the student common room, a group of friends, a student who is A2 is trying to understand a relatively well-pitched text. It might be, for example, a city guide with design for people of international users of English, but it's still a bit too difficult for the A2 level student. So a B2 level student sits down with the A2 level student and helps them to understand the text that happens to be pitched at a B1 level. You'll notice here I'm making a lot of use of CEFR descriptors here, because mediation really is rooted, I think, in the CEFR as far as the language classroom is concerned. But we're not just restricted, of course, to the language classroom. As we'll see from our examples later on, further barriers to understanding might be subject knowledge, the use of specific technical jargon. It might be a cultural issue. It might be to do with the ages of the speakers, their cultural mindset and their opinions. And all of these can be mediated. And I think as we've gone through these examples, it'll be very clear to you just how rich mediation can be in terms of enabling our students to become effective cross-cultural communicators. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested and have become relatively recently so interested in mediation in language teaching, but also in teacher education. So effectively, where is it coming from? If we go back to that Big Bang picture, what we're seeing with the companion volume of the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference, is a movement away from describing language or thinking it conceptually within the framework of reading, writing, listening, and speaking, into the new ways of thinking, or the four modes of communication: reception, production, interaction, and mediation. Now, I'll come back to this distinction between interaction and mediation. That interaction is that dialogic setup between two speakers, and mediation is where you have the three elements involved. And that's the key thing, I think, to take away from today, that distinction between the two-part interaction and the three-part mediation. And remember, the third part might be a text or an idea rather than a person. So picking up from North and Picardo and what they were writing in 2016, and I've highlighted the important bit here in red, when mediating, the language user is often not concerned with expressing their own ideas, thoughts, and opinions. That would be interaction, but simply to act as intermediary between interlocutors or between interlocutors and texts. Okay. So, to underline the point for the final time, with mediation, we have three elements. The information being mediated, the text, the concept, the person, the mediator, and then the recipient, for whom the mediator is simplifying, clarifying, illustrating, paraphrasing the information being mediated. Now, as we'll see in a few moments, mediation is becoming particularly important in coursebooks. But I did just want to make you aware here of a YouTube clip called Mediation, What Is It and How Do I Teach It? And the points being made here by the speakers is that in fact mediation is already something that we are all, as language teachers of English, routinely preparing our students for. Many of you, I'm sure, will have been involved in helping students to improve their scores in the IELTS Academic Writing Task 1, the summary report. And if you think about it, what you're doing here is helping students to take a text in graphic form, and they are the mediators then writing it as a text using language rather than graphics and visuals for an identified reader. This is in itself an act of mediation. In terms of, so mediation isn't just about the speaking skill. We mediate in writing as well as in speaking. Likewise, for the revision of the A2 Key for Schools speaking test, Part 2 introduces lower level mediation skills. And by lower level, I'm talking about cognitively less challenging activities, matching the linguistic skill tested at that A2 level. Now, Cambridge is one of the world's, if not largest, English language testing body, exam board, is actively looking at the possibility of new tasks to include mediation, as well as potentially new tests. LinguaSkill, their latest exam, includes tasks which come out of mediation. There are no decisions yet, as I understand it, about specific mediation activities or mediation criteria that will be used in the exams that already exist from Cambridge, but we can expect developments in the future. We just don't know exactly what they are. So let's just come back for a moment to real life, because I've always believed that what we should be doing in terms of the language classroom is helping our students to be successful in real life. Because if an exam is a good one, it will test the skill that they need in real life. Exams shouldn't be too arbitrary or artificial. So coming up on screen are a number of what I think are kind of ways in which we mediate naturally, authentically. And I'll just let you have a look at these on screen as they appear. Now, as we can see in all four examples, something that we have in common is that you have two people and then something that is being explained, discussed, simplified, and that is the act of mediation. But I've chosen these real life mediation scenarios, so I think they exemplify the way in which mediation fits in very nicely into different types of English language teaching. So coming up on the next screen are, I think, the language type or the language classroom types that we might expect each of these authentic tasks to appear. So we've seen general English for the first one, the explanation of a difficult of a difficult concept to a classmate clearly links both into English for academic purposes, but also English as a medium of instruction. We then have the nurse and the consultant and the patient, fits into medical English as a form of ESP, English for specific purposes, but also of increasing value, I think, in terms of testing, is just how this fits in very well with the occupational English test, which I think I'm right in saying is the test that has the greatest growth of any English language exam right now. And then finally, that last one, a business English context. Now, don't think that you can't move things around a bit here. Students making recommendations about a trip to a new city using city guides. You can change city guides to practically anything. Cinema listings, some train timetables and coach timetables to work out the best way to get across the country from, I don't know, London to Edinburgh, if you've got some students who want to visit another city, another capital. The ESP one here, medicine, could just as easily be any ESP context. And then the business person reporting back on a conference, we could change conference to meeting, seminar, webinar. The world really is our oyster as far as mediation is concerned. And I'm going to be making some suggestions about how you can start thinking up your own mediation tasks in a few moments. So, inevitably then, the question must be raised, to what extent is this filtering through to the classroom? And I think for the classroom, typically, we would expect to see something in coursebooks, Language Hub here as one example, one of many, teacher supplementary and resource materials. And the one you can see on screen here is going to be published later this year in September. And the names Riccardo Chiappini and Ethan Mansour are two of the big leading names in mediation right now. So Google them, there's lots of good stuff out there, buy them. But also I would suggest for teachers to dive into the companion volume of the CEFR, because that provides us with a very rich source of scenarios, which we can then adapt for our own teaching, for creating our own bespoke materials, which I know many of you love doing. So looking at some of the course books and where the publishers are at, perhaps not surprisingly, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I contacted all the main publishers here in the UK, and these are the replies that I've had back. So Oxford have explained that whilst currently they're not explicitly highlighting mediation in their main adult course books, nevertheless, they have written this set of guidelines for teachers called Mediation in English Language Teaching. So it's clearly across their radar. If we look at Pearson, then Pearson tell us that there is an increasing focus on incorporating mediation into their global ELT materials, and that there are specific activities and notes regarding the use of mediation in their roadmap mediation extension pack. Language Hub, Macmillan, very much as a global publisher interested in mediation. And in fact, it was from Macmillan that I first became interested in the concept. They tell us, we take a great interest in mediation and other new descriptors in the revised CEFR. And lower on, they say the activities include mediation of texts and communication in our courses Speak Your Mind and Language Hub. So what we're clearly saying, and here is our last example coming in from NGL, that are tied up, as you know, in many ways with National Geographic, and in their new close-up coursebook. They have one lesson per unit, specifically focusing on communication strategies for intercultural communication, where you're mediating concepts and mediating cultural differences. There are also dedicated worksheets. Excitingly, they also have new course books coming out where, and I quote, mediation skills aren't entirely new. The scales in the CFR serve to provide a framework of reference to skills that students develop to become more effective, more culturally aware, and more empathetic communicators. In other words, the mediation is helping us to move away from tenor, the teach English for no obvious reason, to a much more nuanced approach of general English and then into business English, ESP, EAP, where the students are much better able to work with as 21st century and global citizens. For me, though, this slide that comes from Macmillan, I think, helps me to get my head around how to deal with mediation in a really clear and simple way. Those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy may well be aware of some of the verbs that fit in with Bloom's taxonomy. Here, we take some of the barriers that appear in the coloured language on the left, and they're matched with activities, verbs that allow us to think about how for each domain we can devise mediation tasks for the classroom. So, for example, if we're thinking about age differences, what a wonderful project to take a written text and gamify it for a group of teenagers. If we're thinking about language level, I'll go back to that example of the B2 student working with the A2 student regarding a B1 text. Then it might be about simplify the information, clarify, reformulate the information in the text. So this is a really useful slide, which just gets us straight into the heart of how we do mediation and how we can set up mediation activities in the classroom. So I'll just leave it on screen for a few more seconds for you to look at. Okay, so let's move on and have a look at some examples of mediation activities that hopefully will help to illustrate. So here I'm mediating for you myself subject knowledge. I'm mediating mediation for you. And to do that, one of the things that I'm using is this table that appears from the CEFR. And you'll see that, in fact, mediation is subdivided into activities and strategies. And our focus today is going to be here. It's going to be around the mediation of text, concepts, and communication. So let's begin with mediation activities and mediating a text. I live in Cardiff. I've only lived here for 2 years. And for students who come and study at CELT, the school where I work, where I also teach, Centre for English Language Teaching, one of the things we like to do is make sure that students get familiar with Cardiff as their new home. So, passing on the content of a text to another person. Here's an activity that would work for any city. And it doesn't have to be necessarily using texts that are written in English. So students decide what information they would hope to find in a city guide. What are you interested in? Oh, I want to know where the churches are. I want to know where the discos are. I want to know where the shopping centre is. Students divided into 2 groups, A and B. And Group A has one city guide. Group B has a different city guide. So there we have an information gap immediately set up for us. Students pair up, A with B. They don't show each other their city guide. They mediate the text by explaining what they've seen. So rather than just saying, oh, here's the text, read it, by saying, well, my text told me that there's a really great restaurant, if you like, Indian food on City Road. So what about going there for dinner one evening? Oh, yeah, does it do vegetarian food? Oh, no, this was meat only. Oh, but let me check. Oh, yeah, there's a vegetarian Indian restaurant as well. You see how this is working. So alternatively, role plays, which are great for mediation. You could imagine a scenario with a chat on WhatsApp where a group of students decide what to do on a trip to the city. Only one of them has the city guide, and he passes on to the others in the WhatsApp group information that they find, answering the questions posed by the students on their mobile phones. So again, we're bringing in digital literacy at the same time. Mediating concepts. Okay, I'm sure we're all familiar with the look of this student on his face, clearly feeling a bit confused, doesn't really understand an idea or concept in a lecture. And this is, I think, very useful for the domain of EAP. So, in general English, or in EAP, or in any language classroom, a lovely way of teaching a language point is for the teacher to hand over the teaching to the students. So I remember I was teaching a pre-master's business program, and there were some language areas that the students were struggling with. So they had about a week. They made a list of the language areas that they found difficult. The language areas were divided out into small groups. They then went away, they researched the language, and then they taught it or retaught it to their peers. So here we're mediating language. In EAP, and again, this is something that I was involved in when I was teaching at EAP at a university here in Wales, following a live lecture from an actual university academic, the students would go into little buzz groups, and they would work together to try to recreate the lecture in a summary document, but by reconstituting their own notes and sharing information, pooling ideas. One student might say, I didn't really understand that bit about econometrics in the middle of the lecture. And someone would say, oh, well, what they meant was. So a really nice example of collaborative tasks. And collaboration is by definition a mediation activity. Notice here, of course, also the opportunities for translanguaging. I think an error of many teacher trainers working in the UK is that in the way that they were taught, and I'm talking about myself here, but we used to prize the use of L2 only in the classroom. And there's a swing away from this. I think there's a real opportunity for translation of information here, the use of L1 and L2, but also if you're working abroad, and let's face it, that is the majority of ELT interactions. The majority of English language teaching happens not in English-speaking countries, but overseas. That why not bring in both languages into the classroom? Because that's what students are going to do in the real world anyway. The final area to talk about is mediating communication. And as we can see here from the CEFR, that's broken down into facilitating pluricultural space. So where we have people from many cultures coming together, acting as intermediaries in informal situations, and then the facilitation of communication in delicate situations and disagreements. Now, if you think about it, many of the Cambridge Upper Main Suite collaborative tasks fit this one really nicely. You've got a problem-solving activity where a group of students sit down, they're given a text, and they have to decide, well, you know, which of these are the best solutions or which of these would you not work with? So it might be designing a new city, and you've got pictures of parks, shopping centres. Which ones of these do you want? Which ones of these do you not want? I don't think this is a delicate situation, but there may well be disagreement in terms of agreeing and disagreeing what to include in your master plan for your new city. So I hope what you're beginning to see is, whilst the CFR provides us with a new way of thinking, a new framework in introducing mediation as a clearly defined way of using language away from just speaking, which of course this new way allows us to have both interaction and mediation separated out. But otherwise, the upper main suite, Cambridge First, Cambridge Advanced, Cambridge C2 Proficiency, their speaking activities have been using these for years. Okay, so in terms of mediating communication, here are some suggestions here in terms of that facilitation of understanding and shaping successful communication between users. And here I'm taking an example from ESP, the area of language teaching that I'm most involved with these days. A patient is in hospital and has had recently a meeting with the consultant, who unfortunately is one of these consultants who uses a lot of medical jargon, a lot of technical language. So when the consultant walks away, the patient really doesn't understand what's going to happen to them. And the patient is now anxious and asks a nurse, "Nurse, can you help me to understand what was that all about?" So here you could set up a fantastic role play where you have the consultant who is using technical language, the patient who doesn't really understand what's going on, and the nurse. And the nurse's job is to re-explain, to simplify, to clarify that technical jargon into lay terms for the patient. And this is a wonderful collaborative task. You can just use the 3 students involved, or you could in fact do this in groups of 4, where the 4th person listens and makes notes and then gives feedback on the success of the mediation. So not only do you have the mediator, but you have the 4th person effectively mediating the mediation by giving feedback on what went well, what could be changed. Okay. So again, massive opportunities, I would suggest here, for plurilingual and monolingual applications. So as we come towards the end of this presentation, this workshop, what are my conclusions? Well, first of all, and I think most importantly, mediation is a real-world, authentic, communicative activity. It's not something amazingly new that suddenly we have to teach our students to do, because as we've seen from those examples from the Cambridge Main Suite exams, actually our students have been involved in doing it for a very long time. Its absence in the ELT classroom as something that we talk about explicitly does, I think, impoverish the development of our students' communication skills. So it's not that we're necessarily doing things differently, but perhaps that we're changing our focus, certainly in a speaking skills lesson, but also I think in a writing skills lesson, away from interaction to mediation. It's increasingly on the radar of publishers and exam boards, I think largely as a result of the CFR 2018 companion volume, which really put it much more under the microscope and available to language teachers and to publishers to work with. And I come back to my point about having a look at the 2018 CFR companion volume. If you download it, it's available for free from the internet. You then look at Appendix 6. It gives you a whole list of real-life scenarios that show you how those different mediation activities and strategies are operationalized. And then you can start thinking about, okay, so how would this work in my classroom? Because they're linked to the different CEFR levels, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, it does allow you to fine-tune your mediation activities, or rather your mediation tasks in the classroom, to the level of student you're working with. And finally, I think it fits in very well with the zeitgeist, this increasing interest in the use and the value of L1 and translanguaging generally in the language classroom. So to come to an end, here is a select reading list. I've tried here to give you a mixture of some YouTube videos, which I think some people particularly find easier to deal with than long texts. If you're looking for an academic text, then I'd be recommending Maria Strathpolu's Cross-Language Mediation in Foreign Language Teaching. If you're looking, and it'll be available later this year, for a list of classroom activities to get you going, then published in September, Ricardo and Ethan's Activities for Mediation, Building Bridges in the ELT Classroom, which is being published by Delta. I've not seen the full book, but I have seen some activities from there, some of which appear and adapted in this presentation. I think will be a great place to dive into as well. But don't forget the Council of Europe's own CEFR itself, and particularly the companion volume, because that's where everything came from. So to end, useful resources generally for ELT. Don't forget the fantastic range of workshops being given by Gallery Teachers. We've got the link here to the Gallery Teachers workshops for continual professional development. That's galleryteachers.com/ELT-workshops. And what you might like to do as a mediation activity, either of this presentation, this workshop, or any other workshop that you've enjoyed from Gallery Teachers, is to find a colleague and tell them all about it, because that is an act of mediation. Mediation is an everyday language occurrence. If you're standing around with a group of friends and gossiping, you're mediating. If you're visiting a foreign city with a friend or a partner, and you're looking at a city guide, and you use the city guide to help you to explain to your fellow traveller options for what to do that day, you're mediating. Mediation is something that we've done for years. Yes, mediation is in the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference. And since 2018, with the companion volume, it's something that has come across the radar of ELT publishers, ELT exam boards, many of whom were involved in its development, but also language teachers. And that's why a lot of people are starting to talk about mediation in language teaching today. I believe passionately that the EFL classroom should allow people not to be better language users for the classroom, but to be able to use English or whichever language we're teaching out there in the real world. So if mediation is important in the real world, then of course mediation must be important in the language classroom. We've always done it, we've always taught it. But the new focus and the new awareness of mediation enables us to teach and to help students do better in activities where they're not just interacting, but they're generally mediating. Initial teacher training courses don't do as good a job as I believe they should in preparing teachers to teach mediation in the classroom. As a teacher trainer myself, I've never run a session specifically on mediation on a pre-service teacher training course. I think probably what I should have done and will do in the future is embed mediation into other activities. Short courses of 4 weeks, there's never enough time. But if we can at least make students, trainee teachers aware of mediation and how it differs from interaction, both in terms of what we do in the speaking classroom and ideally the writing classroom as well, then we will be doing a good thing for this new generation of language teachers.